enormously productive writer. Various groups have tried to bring her to this country, and she constantly refuses, and saying always that she's too busy with her new book. And she has published a couple of books this year and is at work on a new novel about chess this time. This one is about math and about chess, but I don't know whether we'll be able to break through and actually get her to come. It would be better if she were sitting here than if I were, but she's an extraordinarily focused writer, and I think the obsessive quality comes through.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I mean, I guess one of the other things that we discussed as well, something that kind of came up is not a theme, but we talked about influence, and we've already talked about, Murakami's influence, and, just sort of almost free association. There's a concept in, not a concept, but it's called eroguro nansensu in Japanese literature, and, it's not just in literature, it was an artistic and literary movement, and it stands for erotic, grotesque nonsense, and it was in the 20s and 30s, this movement, and it's just sort of, it's very popular in academic circles, actually, to discuss it, and since I'm no longer involved in academia, I won't go there because it's a very, it's fraught, but I think it's just enough to point to it, actually, as a presence in Japanese culture, and something that may, have sort of seeped in, because, there is, just the erotic and the grotesque, and grotesque not in sort of a horror, it's not horror, it's more like, like the malformed, or the,
right, almost the freakish.
Unnatural.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So go ahead. Well, I do think that's an interesting thing to bring up in this context. Of course, the chief purveyor of this eroguro nonsense was Edogawa Rampo, who took his name from Edgar Allan Poe, Edogawa Rampo. And he is very self-consciously indebted to Edo period, early modern, pre-1868 Japanese fiction that was in turn indebted to Qing period Chinese ghost stories. And this whole notion of the strange being an appropriate object for literary investigation has a long genealogy in Asian literature in general. Mm-hmm. So the notion that into everyday life something inexplicable and disturbing and somehow twisted can come at any moment is a common thought. I mean, I think that people in general in Japan still, to some extent, believe that ghosts exist, and that this kind of hauntedness in the world goes on. And so literarily, I think that she's in some ways participating in that, although I also think that through Murakami Haruki, who's has very little interest in traditional Japanese fiction, I think some of the influence also comes from magical realism as well. Mm-hmm. But you do get a sense, particularly with the bodies in, for instance, in the dormitory novella. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's a good way to start talking more specifically about these novellas.
Right.
And just the eeriness. If you look on the blurbs on the back of the book, I think 2 out of the 3 have the word eerie in them, and it's just unavoidable. You read it, and they're haunting, and they're odd stories, and so but at the same time they're also they're set in what at first seems to be such a mundane, everyday life, but then upon closer inspection, there's something different about each one of the constructs of the stories. For instance, in the diving pool, in the title story, it's an orphanage, a Christian orphanage, which is already strange. And the pregnancy diary, you have the sisters living together. Sister living with her married sister, that's an unusual arrangement. And the third one's actually not that normal in any way. I guess. Dormitory. There isn't that much that's normal, except for just the way that she sort of goes about her day-to-day business. But then just to start talking about actually the other notion in the diving pool, if we can go through them in order, is the notion of cruelty. And we did talk about this a little last night as well, just cruelty towards children, and how where does that come from, and what does that how does that affect the reader or the writer?
There are a lot of things in what you just went through, and you made me think of narrative voice, and I think we should try to talk about that a little bit. And I want to talk for 1 second about the strangeness you were noticing in the sort of family groupings in all three stories. There is no normative family, and this is something, again, it's a bête noire of academics to talk about the dissolution of the Japanese family. But one thing that's very odd about this is that, of course, the vast majority of people in Japan live in stable nuclear families. And so the idea that again and again in literature you have the family coming to pieces, right, or these malformed or jerry-rigged families is typical not only of Ogawa but of many contemporary Japanese writers who are some people have argued, even Yoshimoto Banana, who are trying to reimagine what the family would look like. I would link that back to something that Ryu Murakami once told me about Japanese fiction, and particularly about his own writing. And if any of you are familiar with books like Coin Locker Babies or In the Miso Soup or Piercing, which is on the shelf over there, these are Ryu Murakami. If you're not familiar with him, is after Murakami Haruki Murakami, probably the most popular writer in Japan from the same generation. But his work is much edgier, much darker, and much more violent than Haruki Murakami's. And Ryu once told me that the reason he writes this way is that he feels that Japan is too safe, that the society is too predictable, that there really isn't anything to shake up the citizens from out of their kind of sleeping state. And so he writes to show them that there is some kind of, what he calls, the Japanese word is sugoi, meaning extraordinary or extreme world that can be accessed through literature. So that would be one thing that there was another question within a question.
We were talking about the cruelty.
Oh, the cruelty. We mentioned a writer last night, Taeko Kono, who has been, a number of her stories have been translated, and she has a volume of short stories called Toddler Hunting, which is very similar, and I would guess would be thematically a source for the diving pool story. It's a novel about cruelty to very young children, and it's such a taboo notion in our society. But I guess that's what made me think of Ryu Murakami's comment, is that this is a society that idolizes its own children and treats them with incredible care. I've had our children in Tokyo more than once, and it's a paradise for them because no one tells them they can't eat in a restaurant. They're just catered to in every way. So the notion of being cruel to children is so transgressive within Japanese society that I think it's almost inevitable that writers would come around to it as a way of really transgressing the boundaries of their own culture.